Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth session of the Commission and ANA's fifth Racism in Nursing series. Whether you've been involved in previous series or are new to this space, we are so excited to be back and hope this interactive learning space is a place for you to find guidance and support. Today's session is one of an 8-part series. You will be able to earn 1.5 continuing nursing education units for attending today's session. Please stay to the end to complete your evaluation and receive your CNE credit. This series is brought to you by the American Nurses Association and the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing, a multi-organizational collaborative of leading nursing organizations examining the issue of racism within nursing and motivating all nurses to confront systemic racism. The Commission and ANA remain committed to driving systematic change within the profession. The association's recent response to executive orders affecting diversity, equity, and inclusion underscores its dedication to advocating for inclusive policies and combating structural inequities in nursing. ANA continues to work with Congress and federal agencies to mitigate the impact of policies that threaten progress in health equity and workforce diversity. Please scan the QR code to learn more about ANA's public statement, Protecting Healthcare for Americans. Before we get started, let's review the ground rules for each of our sessions. Please remember that this is a brave space. Discussing racism and health equity is difficult and uncomfortable, especially for those directly impacted. Discussions such as these can serve as a trigger, so please, if you need to, take care of yourself. We ask that you maintain respect for everyone joining us today. Please stay on mute until it is your turn to speak. Listen intently and respond thoughtfully. Be present. Limit your background distractions and multitasking. Please take advantage of the virtual features available via Zoom. We encourage turning your cameras on and using the chat box or the raise hand features to communicate with the group, but please remember to mute your microphone while others are speaking. Please respect participant privacy. Do not disclose names or other sensitive information shared. If you share a scenario involving a patient, do not provide any personal information during today's call or any of our sessions. Feel free to send a direct message to ANA Practice if you have any technical difficulties during today's call. Please also note that the chat feature will be closed during the presentation. Today's session, Education for Equity, Confronting Racism for Equitable Learning, will be presented by Blake Smith and a panel of experts, Doctors Julius Johnson and Roberta Wade. I will now turn this presentation over to them.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you here today and have this discussion with two wonderful colleagues and friends that I am so grateful to call friends. And we're going to focus today on the educational space. As Ruth had mentioned, this is a brave space. We cannot reiterate that enough. So if you find yourself becoming having some emotions start to come up, it's okay to shut off your camera and collect yourself and come back on. That is okay to do. But without any more wait, let's get into this discussion. So thank you so much, Dr. Waite and Dr. Johnson, for being here today. I wanted to start out as we all have personal journeys through our lives, right? And so I wanted to start out and have each of you kind of share a little bit about of your personal journey through the educational space specifically and what you have experienced yourself as well as what you've seen just as an overview of racism in in education. So let's start with Dr. Waite first. And if you could share some information, be greatly appreciative.
Thank you so much, Blake. And it's so great to be here to be able to share. This is such an important topic to me. And when I sort of reflected and thought back about sort of racism within education, I really see there's been truly deafening silence about racism in nursing education, truly writ large. But in preparing for this, I really did more of a deeper reflection, focused reflection for myself. And truly, as I think about my education through both graduate as well as undergraduate school, racism was not discussed. Now, I'm a little bit older, and so it's been a while, but it wasn't discussed in either my undergraduate or graduate preparation. However, what I would say is the terms that were more common during my time is they talked a lot about multiculturalism, cultural diversity, cultural competence, and significantly, as I reflected, a lot around color blindness. And so those were the common terms that were often used. And a significant issue around color blindness, as you know, if you're saying you're colorblind and you don't see color, then you don't see me. And that not only shuts down communication, but it also has implications for my lived experience of race in the United States, in school, for higher education in my nursing program. And so that's really, really huge. And common, I would say, with that is, I recall when we talked about cultural competence, there was a lot of sort of generic listings, if you will, around what it was like to be African American or Latino or Asian. And really what that was doing was really and truly deepening sort of the stereotypes, if you will. And we know that how harmful that could be around food preferences, around, let's just say, African Americans not feeling as much pain. And so you're grouping populations of people having varied belief systems because each person within that group is not a monolith. Like one person cannot speak for an entire group. So there wasn't a lot of focus, I would say, in my teaching and education, sort of growing up, if you will, as a nurse, really looking at the individual and looking at what are those nuances for their personal preferences. That's something that came later, but really and truly reflecting on my nursing education, that really wasn't taught. And I would even say more specifically, when we talk about race specifically, it wasn't talked about. It was truly just seen as a taboo, very similar to what, had happened recently, specifically up until 2020, where people really specifically stated the word race. And it's very unfortunate because what that allowed to take place, I would say, within sort of just the nursing profession writ large and really within our society, it made us racially illiterate, right? Our population really became racially illiterate in the way of conditioning us, where we really couldn't carry out conversations about what it meant to be a racially just society or having equitable, sort of type of discussion. So there was truly in nursing education a silence, a deafening silence of normalizing sort of the ignorance, if you will, and I would say sort of misunderstandings, which continues to and continue then to truly perpetuate a lot of different harms. So I
Yeah.
would say sort of writ large, it really wasn't talked about during my journey of my formal nursing education in graduate or undergraduate preparation.
Yeah, and unfortunate it doesn't even cover it, right? When we go through
Mhm.
nursing school, we want to take care of the individual as the individual experiences life and what quality means to them. And by not going and understanding these things or even intentfully looking at the human being with from their own experiences, and our background and where we come from drives that experience, right? We are completely taking that part of the individual out of it, and we are truly not holistically taking care of the patient if we are not seeing it through that lens. So I think that I had that same experience myself, Dr. Waite, when I was going through nursing school. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Johnson, I'd like to have you provide some insight of your own personal journey.
Absolutely. So first, I want to say welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. It is great to be here with you all and sharing this space and engaging in this topic. I know that engaging in this topic can also be difficult. And I also know that in order to grow, you have to have some uncomfortability. So I just want to, make sure everybody feels welcome in that uncomfortability space that we're about to journey into. So for me, I would put really my experience with racism into two parts in terms of the nursing education. First, as a student. In undergrad, I wouldn't say I didn't necessarily see it, but I was in survival mode, right? I don't know many undergrad students who are not just in survival mode or just trying to get by. But when you go to grad school, it then becomes kind of a choice of you going back. Plus, also, you're making money now. So, you feel much more comfortable in talking and speaking up. And the common theme I always saw in grad school was every time we would start discussing um, morbidities and diseases, it would always be risk factor, being Black American, risk factor, Black American, right? Hypertension, risk factor, Black American, hyperlipidemia, risk factor, Black American, diabetes, risk factor, Black American, chronic kidney disease, risk factor, Black American. And I remember talking to my professors and I was going, can you please stop telling me that the color of my skin is a risk factor? Only thing I did was be born. And because I was born, you telling me that in and of itself is a risk factor for this. We're not talking about anything else. And then I remember we would start engaging in conversation and they would talk about some of the research studies that they're doing. And I remember specifically this one time they was referencing some research that they were engaged in Virginia. And I told them, I was like, respectfully, whatever you have going on in Virginia does not reflect on what I have going on in Brooklyn, New York, and Brownsville, where I'm from, right? Like it doesn't correlate. You can't put it on me. And it caused a lot of tension because they were not used to students speaking up. They were not used to students engaging in what I call um, intellectual discourse. And it caused really a rift. And I really disliked, and I would even go on to say hated grad school because of it. Like I felt like I had to speak up all the time. And every time I spoke up about it, it was an issue. And then translated into once I started teaching. And I remember I was at one university and I started looking at some of our transition policies, meaning students transitioning from first semester to second semester to third semester and fourth semester. And one of the biggest contentions was always the amount of students that was dropping out and the amount of students that was failing out, really. And as I looked at it, the school I was at was a minority serving institution. So we were mainly minorities. And I was looking at our grading policies versus the predominantly white institutions we are surrounded by. And what I realized is that we were making our students get higher grades to become nurses versus the institutions around us. And when I brought it up, it was a mixture of one, nobody felt any way about that, versus another group just felt like, well, we have to be more tough on these students because of where they're coming from. And I just couldn't understand because we're all trying to get the same type of degree. And what I also then started having a conversation surrounding was that the whole purpose of a racist system is so that after it's created, you can remove every person that is racist out of it and put in and fill it completely with people who are not racist, and it's going to produce racist outcomes without people knowing. And that's what I was trying to get them to understand, right? Like nobody in that room was a bad person. Nobody in that room had created those grading policies, but we were all being adherent to those policies. And therefore, we was creating these outcomes where we're making people get higher grades to become nurses, right? We're kicking them out more versus other places. And it was a good experience because that also happened around the time that I was working on the commission to address racism in nursing. So it was just a good comparable experience, but I'll also save some of that for later, for the conversation later on. But I'll pause there, Blake, and hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. And so we know that we didn't get here yesterday, right? this has been something that's been going on since the beginning of our country's history. And I think a lot of times, unfortunately, there's some communities that completely can have the privilege of blocking that out and get away and not have to have these uncomfortable conversations. So that's why I'm so glad so many of you, coming from so many backgrounds, are here today to be uncomfortable and have this conversation. So I wanted to start with the history first, because we have to understand, if we want to know where we're going and how to make progress in this, we have to understand where we've been and how we got here. And so, Dr. Johnson, I want to start with this question with you is, with our country's founding and the values of our country and the norms that were of that time and continued throughout history, how do you think that added or helped create the environment of how we got here and how it impacted the system inequities of certain communities?
Absolutely. So I think when you create something and you feel like as a creator it is of excellence, right? So as America is being founded and it's supposed to be founded as this country of excellence, and they start achieving, let's call it global greatness, right? As being the country of America, what it's doing, you tend to replicate that in every system under you, right? That's part of your country. So it makes perfect sense why healthcare would be replicated or formed in the same image as the country was formed in. And if the country was formed in an image of where certain populations were looked at as unequal or three-fifths, right? You're also going to treat them that way all the way down to the healthcare system. So we're not exempt from that. And I think you saw that play out in terms of um, even back when you look at the way that the person who they call the father of gynecology and the group of women that he experimented on because he thought that they didn't share pain, right? So he took these black women, he made all of these experiments on them. And then he used that to save another group of population of women, but then still treated those black women a certain way, right? They really received less health care. Their midwives was looked down upon as if they weren't equal to. So you have those, right? And then you can track all the way up to, I know we stopped calling it the Tuskegee experiment and started calling it the United States public health government experiment that took place in Tuskegee, right? When you look at those and you look at them saying that, oh, we're just going to look at this treatment and watch it develop in this group of black men. But then you have that group of black men going to their family saying, something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. I'm not getting better. But they're going to the healthcare system, right? Because your family is saying, go see the doctor, go see the doctor. And as you go see them, something's wrong. And the way that we pass down stories in certain cultures, right? My culture specifically, as an African American that's descended from slavery in America, our biggest way to pass down culture and experience is through storytelling, right? You talk about what you experience. Because the history, again, going back to the way the country was founded, we weren't allowed to go to school, right? So you were taught by story making. And that just goes into the way that healthcare is formed, right? It goes in the way that you share and you experience healthcare. Therefore, it's also going to go into the way that you do research in healthcare. And then that's going to be translated into the way that you teach healthcare, right? Like if we put research at the top of everything that we're doing academic wise, then whatever you research, so if you have biases in your research, whenever you find the outcomes, you're going to now teach that into your schools to be taught to students. That's now going to continue that on.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Johnson. And I preface the question that way because I think you did such a great job of sometimes we think of different industries in silos and they don't play on one another. And we have to have an understanding that the global society and the environment we find ourselves in and from the history of that affects everything that we do to participate in society. And that includes healthcare itself. And so, Dr. Waite, as Dr. Johnson said, all that kind of trickles down into our healthcare system. I wanted to get your perspective on how the system inequalities in healthcare has specifically affected nursing students and educators in these marginalized communities.
No, absolutely. And Dr. Johnson really laid a nice foundation because when you think about systemic inequalities, structural racism is the foundation to the rise, to me, from my perspective, of all systemic inequalities and systemic inequities for both nursing students as well as educators, specifically those from Black and Brown racialized populations. We have to think about it when there's little representation for faculty and for leadership of these students and for faculty. For students, it's really missed mentorship as well. And it makes a difference when you're able to see faculty that look like you. I know for myself in coming up through school, out of all of my undergraduate education, I did not have a Black faculty member until I went to graduate school doing my clinical work at the University of Pennsylvania. Someone who I still admire to this day is Dr. Frida Outlaw. And so that truly can make a difference. Not that it should, because we should be able to have really rich conversations, really having knowledge developed and the appropriateness of the knowledge that's used so that it is not, as Dr. Johnson was talking about, really deepened with the racial and biological essentialism, really projecting race as the problem, whereas really racism is what's leading those issues and guiding that narrative of what's creating those differences. But then also as students and then as faculty, I also think it's so huge to take into account the mental and the emotional labor that it takes, that I don't think that we can ignore when we're talking about systemic inequalities, because we bring on a lot more because we want to make sure that our students are doing well and they're juggling a lot at school. Our faculty are juggling a lot of work at work. So there's sort of like a lot of extra unseen effort or tax, if you will, that we have to put forward. We shouldn't have to explain our identity. We shouldn't have to constantly be pushing for fairness, but those are things that are sort of normalized within our processes. And I also believe, picking up a little bit from what Dr. Johnson was saying around those systemic inequalities, is when we're looking at our students, there's a lot within grading practices. There is such subjectivity for our students' grades and the appropriateness of, sort of how we're grading them, how we're assessing them. Are they presenting in the best light? There's such tension in how our students present in wearing their natural hair. I mean, anytime you are have to have a policy to wear your natural hair, to wearing braids, it just tells you how deeply entrenched and naturalized and how we're conditioned to think about what is respectable, if you will, when students are presenting. And so there's not a one size fits all as it relates to that. We need to have a broader umbrella, even to how we teach, right? There's not a one size fits all approach to teaching the material that we're using, because I know a lot of material that we're using, they are deeply grounded in eugenics, in the eugenics perspective and biological essentialism. And those things actually have to be eradicated. And there's a lot of, I think, teachable moments that our educators have today, because all of what Dr. Johnson was just talking about is laid out in our psychology books. It's laid out in our nursing books. And so if we are conditioning our students to learn this material and we're not course correcting to say why this material should not be there, or is an error, or continues to harm and perpetuates those stereotypes, that's a problem. Because there are a lot of things within our hidden curriculum that informs what's important to know, what's not important to know. And it inhibits our students' ability to really critically think about these issues on a deeper level. So I think looking at our content, the material, what counts as knowledge is really hugely important. But at its foundation, a lot of the issues around structural racism, they create the structural inequalities hugely within nursing education. And I would say another driver, before I sort of pass it on, because I know Dr. Johnson has some rich things to share about this, I really think our nursing education from a faculty standpoint, because I think students are there, really needs to take on a much stronger lens of structural competence and determinants of education, as well as determinants of health. And I think those things are hugely need to be understood to understand why and how a lot of these inequalities or inequities arise, and then also the actions that are required to take place both individually and collectively, because to me, that's when we can really live our true values of trying to actualize social justice, which is a core tenet within nursing.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wade. And there's two things that I heard in there. One is around social determinants of health or social drivers of health or inequities, health
I was
disparities, whatever you
structural.
would call it.
I'm really focusing on the structural
Yeah,
because the structural brings forth the social pieces.
exactly. And that's my point is a lot of people just stop there. They're like, oh, that's where it begins. Well, that is an outcome many times. That is what we're seeing metastasize from things upstream. And that is the structural piece. And if we are not, the other thing I heard was if we are not self-reflective or that emotional intelligence piece to be self-aware, not just individually, but as an entity, as a school of nursing, as a health system, and really being critical of ourselves and looking through our policies, looking through what we do impacts those that we serve, whether it's nursing students, communities, et cetera, we're going to only see the outcomes and be putting the band-aids on things, trying to instead of treating the source of the issue. And that's upstream in the structural racism piece that has been in place for so long. And so, Dr. Johnson, I kind of want to start slowly moving into the present. And we are a little bit at talking with about current marginalized communities and students, but we find ourselves now in an environment that where for a few years we thought, we're making progress, and I truly believe we are, but now we're waking up the other side of the pendulum that is now pushing back incredibly hard, and where we're making this acronym, this boogeyman, and without the understanding of truly what it means. It's just a throwaway acronym that you can hide behind many times. And so what do you believe, or what have you seen are some of the root behaviors or the foundational harms that perpetuate anti-DEI perspectives, in your opinion? And what are some more prevalent forms of racism that can occur because of that in nursing education?
Absolutely, it's a great question. So the first one I would say is the stigmatization of DEI, as well as the dog whistling of it, right? Like we have gotten to a point where when you whisper this name DEI, there's an automatic reflection or automatic response of, oh, that's racist, right? Like, oh, that's racist. And now you're backed into a corner of trying to defend something from a stance that you should never have to take, right? Because anytime you talk about the words DEI, you are addressing racism. So if somebody then turns around and say, oh, this is racist, this is racism, you defend and tell me why it's not, right? A lot of people aren't necessarily prepared to take that stance. And then also, I think more importantly, the biggest reason and the biggest danger that to DEI, right, that's causing the rise of anti-DEI is the foundation of what the country was built on, which goes back to what I said in terms of when the country was originally started, right? Like you can remove everybody out of a system that is not racist, but if the system itself is racist, it's going to produce those outcomes. So now you have people that standing up and trying to fight against this, right? Like they're trying to fight against this. And what I would say is my biggest thing is when you talk in terms of strategy, you have to be willing to innovate, to learn from what's going on, and to grow, right? And one of the things that we talked about, just to give y'all a peek behind the scenes in the meeting, was that we were going to get through a large portion of this conversation without using any of the terms DEI, which for the first couple of questions, we didn't use at all. But everything we said speaks about DEI, right? And it's one of those where some of us are going to be able to be stubborn and pound our head on this. And then there's going to be many people who are going to be forced to adapt and have to change their verbiage because they are at risk of losing their livelihood, of losing their institution's grants, right? Like you see what's going on. Everybody doesn't have billions of dollars like Harvard has to say, no, like I'm going to stand up and I'm going to do this. So for those who can't, it just means that you have to still do all of the work without saying the words, because when you do the work, it is the actual words, right? And for me, it's just when you go back to the beginning of before we created the term DEI, we were speaking on the actual facts of what's going on, right? We're saying there's disparities within maternal health. There are disparities within our hypertension rates, our death rates, our cancer rates. There's disparities between how we are teaching education. There's disparities between who is getting into nursing schools and who were being hired by the top magnet hospitals. We were saying all of that. It just so happened that somebody along the road came and then created this great concept, which was DEI, right? So it just means that we go back to the beginning of talking about all of those same things to the point where we now put the people who are anti-DEI in a corner without using the words and saying, this is what's going on with the country. This is what's wrong with education. And I want you to give me an explanation of why it's going on and how can we fix this.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I want to give Dr. Wade, I want you, because this is such a relevant thing right now, I want to give you an opportunity to answer the same question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we're, just honing in and focusing on DEI is one thing, and I think it's a big deal in the sense that it's the external trying to control our language and our freedom to speak in ways that we want to and things that we're passionate about. And one of the things that I think really could really flip this around is looking at what are we trying to do? We are trying to enable our whole communities, all of our people to be able to thrive. So what will it take to allow our people, when I say people at writ large, are all of everyone within our communities to be able to thrive? And when you're focusing on trying to make people their healthiest and moving us into be able to thrive, you're going to be addressing some of those other things. It's a like framing. And so in what ways do you need to frame? And I would say, as Dr. Johnson mentioned, in what ways are we able and need to be doing the work and not just the talk? Because oftentimes I would even say words and discussions were happening, words were being used, action was not being used to transform any systems of inequity to truly make any type of meaningful change. So I don't want to get stuck on the words, but I understand the importance of being able to narrate and control your own language, because when someone comes in and says you cannot do that, there's a process of grief that you go through when you can't do that, and it has real impact. I would also say, looking at what is it that we're striving to do, and it's narrating and saying, I want us to be able to thrive. What is it going to take? Because it's going to take an impact different groups and individuals differentially based on how they are resourced within our society. And so I think that is a big piece of moving into action to be able to uplift and not only just focus on sort of, we know that there are huge disparities and so forth. I want to be able to have people to be able to live their lives in a liberated manner and for them to be able to not just be healthy, but to thrive. And what does that take? And it's going to take different things, again, for different individuals based on their positionality and within the United States, based on their racialization, because that's the biggest thing that gets us hooked because of what race is tethered to and the ideology that goes along with that. And then how we determine we want to resource it based on our values aligned with it.
Yeah, I agree that, you could give it any acronym you want. It's not about the acronym. It's about being a genuine, empathetic, and curious person. Like, and that is, to me, what everyone should strive to be. If you are those things, in theory, you should be able to engage in conversations that may be uncomfortable with you, but truly seek to understand and not to respond. And those who have heard me speak before on similar topics, you're probably, oh, he's going to say it again. I'm a white privileged male, if you haven't noticed. And I'm proud of my heritage, but what I do know is that I have to be in tune with myself, and I had to do the work, and I continue to do the work every single day of my life, and I will to the end of my days. And you'll always hear me say I'm an ally in progress. It is not up to me to give me the title of ally, but it's based off my actions and what I do, that one of my colleagues who may come from a different community or marginalized community or another individual to introduce me as an ally. And for those who have had that happen to them, to me, it's one of the greatest thing that's ever happened to me in my life outside of my marriage and my kids, because that to me is I'm on the right track. Am I going to make mistakes? Absolutely. I know I will, even though I'm in the space right now in my journey. But I have to forgive myself and then genuinely ask for forgiveness. And if you do that genuinely with empathy and you're curious, you'd be surprised at how gracious people could be to make progress and have those uncomfortable conversations. And so that's when I challenge people when they try to throw that DEI at me. And I come from all my white communities, my families, all that stuff in the middle of Nebraska here is, aren't you a genuine, empathetic, and curious person? If that's who you are, if that's who you stand to be, then you need to be in these conversations. And so going off that, talking a little, let's move to more about what can we do now? We talked about the history. We talked about what presently we have been we're seeing in education, but what it's about action. So we need to talk about what are we going to do, and hopefully this will set us up for our breakout sessions here. So, Dr. Wade, I'll give you the first question, and I'm kind of deeming this the future, but this is what can we do now? And so, how can nursing education curriculum and pedagogy be restructured to better address and combat this structural racism that's inherent to our educational systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a sort of nursing education and pedagogical component, I think I hit on that earlier in that it's not sort of a one size fits all. And I think sort of how we go about teaching our students is going to be important. I know the material that we use is going to be really important, and it's going to take all hands on deck, right? So no matter who you are, everyone has to be involved and engaged in sort of promoting meaningful discussions, and I would say having an accountable space and not just discussions, but discussions, planning, and action. And it's sort of like being and understanding where we are and what we want to do, and having truly our values aligned with our actions. It sounds simple, but those are the things that we really need to do and really break out of challenging, I would probably say, a lot of sort of polarization that can happen in discourse, because we're going to agree to disagree, right? Now, I think to the point of where your disagreement is trying to kill me, that's a different thing. But I think we have to truly compare and contrast, also looking at what has been done, what has worked in the past, what are those things that we need to do moving towards the future? And the reason why I say this is sort of like a fertile open ground is because we have never been where I think we need to be. Because if we're really trying to really strive towards health equity, if we're striving towards promoting the humanism of everyone, everyone has not been treated with full humanity. So even realizing and moving into this space is something really new. So when you were talking about sort of having curiosity, creativity, imagination, valuing everyone, I would say human equity in that way, that is something we have just not experienced in the United States.
Yeah.
So again, moving into these spaces, we have to have these opportunities, and we're not going to always get it perfectly. But if we're not taking action and being purposeful and being intentional, and sort of breaking out of these normative ways of what has conditioned us to get us to where we are today, we're not going to make that movement into action. We have to ask new questions, right? And we also absolutely, I think you touched on a little bit earlier, Blake, in this movement, we really have to build strength and muscle around our social and emotional competence. Because this isn't easy work, right? It's not work that it can't be done. It can, because this was human created. All of this mess that we're dealing with right now, even with the executive orders and all of the challenges of what we're sort of experiencing now, is manufactured madness. It doesn't have to be with these executive orders. It's all manufactured. However, even the inequities, the racism, the oppression of what we are dealing with now among many different populations, it was human manufactured, so it can be undone. If we have the will to do it, the determination, but it's not going to happen with people sitting in their corners or with silence or with fear.
Exactly. And I think it's I'm kind of watching the chat here on the side too. And I'm talking about incivility and everything is part of emotional intelligence is self-regulation, right? Being able to have that empathy when you're having those difficult conversations to understand what emotions you're having and that they're real, but how to work through those to have a meaningful conversation with someone and not just go to your corners and not talk to one another, which I think we see more than the former, unfortunately, at this current time. So I think it's working on ourselves of being able to get in those high pressure situations and be able to work through those and working on our own emotional intelligence is what we all should be working on, period, as individuals. But there's not enough of that in the United States right now, and we need more of that in our educational systems as well. But I want to build off that, Dr. Waite, with Dr. Johnson. And it feels like we take one step forward and three steps backwards, all this stuff. But from the work that you have been doing, and maybe with others that you are in your network, what are some effective strategies for promoting health equity that you may seen in nursing schools when you teach through these educational programs? Because we always sometimes talk about what doesn't work or what are the barriers, but what are some of the things that you may have seen work? And then Dr. Waite, I'm going to come back to you because I'm sure you have a few examples as well.
Absolutely. Great question. So first I would say is understanding the battlefield. And I think sometimes what happens is that we lose hope and give up when we create not unrealistic expectations, but unrealistic timelines, right? And what I mean by that is that, like, I understand that if you are a professor at a school, talking about all of this and what you want to change is great, but I also fully understand that professors have passing rates to keep up, NCLEX rates to keep up, right? You have board for nurse practitioner rates to keep up. And these organizations aren't ready yet to create the kind of questions that would be needed for students to learn and to know to pass. So it's still based on old things, right? So we still have to be able to teach that so our students pass so that we still have jobs. So you have to be able to do both. So when I'm teaching, and one of the things I love doing is that I tell my students at the beginning of every class, there's an ivory tower and there's a real world. The ivory tower is everything that's going to be on your test and what you're going to need to pass your NCLEX or your nurse practitioner boards. The real world is what you're going to see in the real world. So when you hear me say one of the two, know where you are which house you are putting it in, right? And that has worked great because I'll have students that will speak on it. They'll do presentations and they'll talk about things from the real world. And then they'll throw in an ad and say, if this is the ivory tower, this is what I'll do, right? And then they'll also, because students are students, hey, Dr. J, which one is going to be on the test? So we know which one to study more, right? Because you're going to get that. The other thing is going to be what I like to say is the way that we translate our research into education. And I'll give you a prime example. The OHAT trial, right? And the OHAT trial, I'm not here to necessarily knock it because it was the first of its kind to try to create some sort of, not necessarily race-based medicine, but try to address some of the responses to hypertension medication, right? But what ends up happening is that when you don't fully implement all of the guidelines into your education, you can implement something that can be harmful. And what I mean by that is that within that trial, it came out that because of the amount of Black folks they tested with ACE inhibitors, treated with ACE inhibitors, and the response that they had, it just became general knowledge that you were not going to give any Black people this while in America. Meanwhile, Black people come from this whole huge diaspora and they don't all react the same. However, in that same OHAT trial, at the bottom of it, it says, if this person has kidney damage, you're going to put them on a low dose ACE inhibitor no matter what. That's not being taught across the board. So what ends up happening is that you end up treating people, they end up developing kidney damage, and then it's never to the point where you actually put them on an ACE inhibitor because you only took a snapshot. So we have to be really intentional about the way that we're taking our research and translating that into education. We also have to be really intentional about the type of practice projects that we're going to create, all right? Because when you create those projects, it can address some of those issues. And it also gives students and professors leadway into doing some of the real world versus the ivory world tower, versus the ivory tower things that also keeps their interest. So now I know I'm serving both sides. I'm serving the side that I need for students to pass, but I'm also serving the real world of what's actually going on while others are changing the system around me. And then some of the other stuff I like talking about, because I welcome students to ask questions, to be free, and to also understand, like I said at the top of the meeting, it's going to be some sort of uncomfortableness. Some people generally don't know anything else. And where we may be calling it or saying this, oh, this is racist, this is just the way they were taught. And if you are never willing to listen and hear them out, we are never going to move them on the side of where they need to be in order to create health equity. So creating that space for students, for other faculty, and then also my last point, what I would say is that um, when going back to when we talked about the anti-DEI rhetoric and it becoming dog whistle, understanding how you can also turn some of that back. So my favorite thing to do is we'll be in class, we'll be having a conversation, and somebody will say, "Oh, but Dr. J, all lives matter," and I'll tell them, "You know what? You absolutely right. All lives do matter. So because all lives do matter, I'm now sitting here and looking at everybody should go have a birth. Every woman should have a birth and come back home with a healthy baby, and everybody should be happy and healthy, right?" And they say, "Yes, absolutely, because all lives matter." Yes. So what happens when somebody is not coming home that way? We should look into it because all lives matter. And they say, exactly. All right. So I start looking and saying, there's some Black women that are 4 times more likely to die while giving birth. And I'll say, but all lives matter, so we need to look into them so we can bring them up to speed. And now they're just kind of looking at me like, oh, I'm in a corner. I don't know what to say. Right. But we've created this space of intellectual discourse and also some uncomfortability, whereas I'm bringing them across the room now as we are talking. Right. And everybody can engage in that. And so for me, those have been some of the things that has really worked in the education atmosphere.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Wade, we have about a minute or so, so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I want you to
No,
have
you
the
know what? I'm
opportunity
not
to
gonna,
answer.
no problem. And I'm not even gonna duplicate because I think Dr. Johnson did a great job. The one thing I would do, because I really think we need to be held accountable, because you're absolutely right. Students are concerned. They want to pass the NCLEX. They want to pass their state boards. They want to know what they need to know. I also think it requires us to be able to teach that infuses, when I say our values of what is going to be relevant for students to know, and how we do our teaching is important. But then we have to hold ourselves accountable, because when we talk about creating the NCLEX, passing the NCLEX, it's not an abstract or some other people, it's us. It's nurses. It's our colleagues who are actually developing the questions. It's our colleagues who create those exams. So it almost it has to be sort of like a from a micro to a macro, but then also having us and people who recognize all of and how this is tethered together in those spaces, so their voices and the work can also help to move and drive not just our profession, which influences our students, the learning, and then the outcomes of what impacts our individuals, families, and communities that we care about. So I absolutely agree. It's both and. It's getting the students through, but then it's also changing our practice as educators, our practice as researchers, and how we develop those research questions, and how we're trying to move towards equity, and not only just looking at disparities, because we know differences, right? How are we moving that then so that or the implementation of our interventions can truly make a difference? Because it's not about controlling for race, let's just say, in research. It's about looking at the process of what's making these outcomes possible. So it's looking at that process of racism and how that is influencing these outcomes. So it's not race that needs to be looked at, it's racism. And then what are those quantitative measures and methods that they're using? Because something that they should be influencing is using the quant-crit methods, because those methods can really land in looking at what's producing those inequities, really moving racism through versus race. So it's all about critically looking at everything that we're doing, from the touch points with our students in undergraduate to our graduate, from the research that's taken place, from the practice, and then what's driving that optimally, which our students are looking at, those outcomes on those tests, right? So how are we creating and developing those questions in those tests that actually hold these schools accountable? So it really is an umbrella area that we really have to tap into to create these changes, to really be in alignment and to take effect, to move much more towards a just, I would say, profession and a more just world, so that we can serve our communities much better.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Wade, Dr. Johnson. I think this is a great segue into our breakout session. And so, what we're going to do next with our time together is we're going to break out, and you will have a facilitator that will go over a few questions and give opportunity for everyone here today to kind of engage in a discussion. And that'll be about 20-25 minutes, which is not never enough time. We understand. But then we're going to come back here and kind of do some report outs, maybe from some of the facilitators of kind of what was discussed in each section. So here are the questions for the facilitators. Please let the staff know if you do not have these questions, and they will get them to you. And it's also at the very top of the chat if you were here early in the session. But at this time, I'm going to have the team that's helping run the program set us up into breakout sessions, and we will see everyone in about 20-25 minutes.